When the heart stops and the brain flatlines, you do not end. You continue into a dimension of...
In 1983, a classified report was quietly filed inside the United States Army Intelligence and Security Command at Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. The document was written by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell, a military intelligence officer who had been given a highly unusual assignment. His commanding officer had tasked him with investigating a program known as the Gateway Experience, a consciousness training system developed in partnership with a private research facility nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The goal of this program was not to build a better weapon or develop a faster aircraft. It was to determine whether the human mind could be trained to leave the physical body, travel across dimensions, and access information that no satellite, no spy, and no interrogation technique could ever reach. The report was 29 pages long. It drew upon quantum mechanics, holographic theory, biomedical engineering, and neuroscience. And its conclusion was staggering. Human consciousness, McDonnell wrote, is not confined to the brain. It is not limited by the skull. It is not even limited by death. Consciousness, according to this classified United States government document, is a form of energy. And energy, as the most basic law of physics tells us, can never be created or destroyed. It can only change form. For nearly 2 decades, this document sat in a vault. It was classified. It was buried. The American public had no idea it existed. Then, in 2003, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified the report and released it through its Freedom of Information Act reading room. But there was a problem. Page 25 was missing. The most critical page of the entire document, the page that reportedly contained the final conclusions about what happens to consciousness when it separates from the physical body, had vanished. It would take another 18 years before that missing page was finally recovered and made public in 2021. And what it contained shook the internet to its core. But the Gateway Report was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a much larger, decades-long effort by the United States government to understand the nature of human consciousness and its potential military applications. And the deeper you dig into this story, the more you realize that America's most powerful institutions, the Pentagon, the CIA, the Army, and some of the nation's most elite universities, have been quietly investigating the same extraordinary possibility for over 50 years. The possibility that when you die, you do not simply cease to exist. The possibility that consciousness survives. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to 1958 to a man named Robert Monroe. Monroe was a successful New York broadcasting executive who had no interest in the paranormal. He was a businessman, a practical man, a thoroughly American man. But one night, while experimenting with audio learning techniques designed to help people absorb information during sleep, something happened to him that he could not explain. He found himself floating above his own body. He could see his physical form lying on the bed below him. He could see the room. He could move through walls. He was, by every definition, having what would later be called an out-of-body experience. Monroe was not the type to run to a psychic or consult a crystal ball. He was an engineer at heart, so he did what any good American engineer would do. He began to study it. He designed experiments. He built equipment. He recruited test subjects, and over the next several decades, he developed a system of audio frequencies that could reliably induce altered states of consciousness in ordinary people. He called the underlying technology Hemi-Sync, short for hemispheric synchronization, because it worked by synchronizing the electrical output of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Monroe founded the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, and his work attracted an audience he never expected. The United States military came calling. Specifically, the Army's Intelligence and Security Command wanted to know whether Monroe's techniques could give American soldiers an edge in intelligence gathering. Could a trained operative use an out-of-body state to conduct surveillance on an enemy target thousands of miles away without ever leaving a room in Virginia? The answer, according to those who participated in the resulting classified programs, was yes. The most well-known of these programs was Project Stargate. Officially funded from 1978 to 1995, Stargate was a Defense Intelligence Agency program that trained military personnel in a technique called remote viewing, the ability to perceive and describe distant locations, objects, or events using nothing but the mind. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, the program employed dozens of military-trained remote viewers and produced thousands of intelligence reports. Some of those reports were startlingly accurate. In one documented case, a remote viewer accurately described the construction of a previously unknown Soviet submarine at a classified naval facility, a finding later confirmed by satellite imagery. In another, a viewer located a downed American aircraft in Africa that conventional search methods had failed to find. But Project Stargate was only the operational arm of a much deeper investigation. The theoretical foundation was laid out in McDonnell's Gateway Report, and it is in that document that the true implications become clear. McDonnell did not simply write about remote viewing. He wrote about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Drawing on the work of physicist Itzhak Bentov and the holographic theories of Carl Pribram of Stanford University and David Bohm of the University of London, McDonnell constructed a model of consciousness that reads more like a physics textbook than a military memo. According to this model, the universe is not made of solid matter. At the subatomic level, everything that exists is composed of oscillating energy fields. What we perceive as solid objects, tables, chairs, our own bodies, are actually extraordinarily complex interference patterns of energy, vibrating at specific frequencies. The universe, in this framework, is a hologram, and the human mind is also a hologram, one that is capable of resonating with and reading the universal hologram around it. When the brain achieves a state of deep coherence, when the left and right hemispheres are synchronized, and the body enters a profound state of physical relaxation, the frequency of consciousness can accelerate to extraordinary levels. At that point, according to the report, consciousness begins to operate beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. McDonnell cited a principle from quantum mechanics known as Planck's distance. When the speed of an oscillating wave drops below 10 to the negative 33 centimeters per second, it exits the space-time dimension entirely and enters what physicists call the absolute, a state of infinite, unbounded energy. In plain language, the classified position of the United States Army in 1983 was that human consciousness, when properly trained and focused, can transcend the physical body, move beyond the dimension of space and time as we know it, and access a realm of existence that has no boundaries, no beginning, and no end. This is not mysticism. This is not religion. This is what was written in a classified military intelligence document produced by a lieutenant colonel for his commanding officer at Fort Meade. Now, fast forward 4 decades. In September of 2023, a team of researchers led by Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University's Langone Medical Center published the results of the largest scientific study ever conducted on human consciousness during cardiac arrest. The study was called AWARE-2, and it tracked 567 patients who experienced in-hospital cardiac arrest across multiple medical centers. Of those patients, 53 survived. 28 were able to undergo structured interviews, and of those 28, 11, nearly 40%, reported vivid, lucid experiences of consciousness that occurred during the time when their hearts had stopped beating, and their brains showed no measurable electrical activity. These were not vague impressions. Patients described specific events that happened in the room during their resuscitation. They described conversations that occurred between doctors and nurses. They described visual details that they could not possibly have perceived if their consciousness had truly ceased. And in some cases, the monitoring equipment confirmed it. Electroencephalography recordings showed sudden surges of gamma wave activity, the brainwave signature most closely associated with heightened consciousness and lucid thought, occurring at the precise moments when these patients reported their experiences. This finding was consistent with a landmark study published earlier that same year by researchers at the University of Michigan. In that study, 2 patients who had been declared brain dead and removed from life support showed an explosive surge of gamma wave activity in the moments following the removal of their ventilators. The gamma waves appeared in the temporoparieto-occipital junction, the very region of the brain associated with consciousness, dreaming, and out-of-body experiences in epilepsy patients. The activity lasted for several minutes. It was organized. It was coherent, and it occurred in brains that, by every clinical definition, were supposed to be dead. Dr. Jimo Borjigin, the neuroscientist who led the Michigan study, described the findings in carefully measured scientific language. But the implications were extraordinary. The dying brain, far from shutting down, appeared to be surging with activity. It was as if, at the moment of death, the brain was not extinguishing consciousness, but rather amplifying it. Then, in early 2026, the picture became even more dramatic. A comprehensive review study published in February revealed that across multiple cardiac arrest studies, 20% of survivors recalled conscious experiences during periods when their brains showed no cortical activity. The study also reported evidence suggesting that the brain may retain some form of functional activity for minutes to hours after clinical death. Dr. Parnia, commenting on these findings, stated that the traditional understanding of death as a single, instantaneous event was fundamentally wrong. Death, he argued, is a process, and during that process, consciousness may persist far longer than anyone had previously believed. These are not fringe studies published in obscure journals. These are research programs conducted at New York University, the University of Michigan, Stony Brook University Medical Center, and published in Resuscitation, one of the most respected peer-reviewed medical journals in the world. This is American science operating at the highest level, and it is converging on a conclusion that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Consciousness does not require a functioning brain to exist. And this brings us back to where we started. The classified report from 1983 said the same thing. The United States Army, working with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Monroe Institute, concluded that consciousness is a form of energy that operates independently of the physical body. The most advanced American medical research of the 21st century is now providing empirical evidence for precisely that claim. The thread that connects a military intelligence office at Fort Meade in 1983 to a cardiac arrest research lab at NYU in 2023 is unbroken. But there is another thread in this story, and it runs through one of the most dramatic personal accounts in American medical history. In 2008, Dr. Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon who had spent 15 years on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. He had performed over 4,000 brain surgeries. He was, by his own admission, a thoroughgoing scientific materialist who believed that consciousness was nothing more than a byproduct of neurochemical processes in the brain. Near-death experiences, in his professional opinion, were hallucinations produced by a dying organ. Then, in November of that year, he contracted a rare and devastating form of bacterial meningitis that attacked his brain's neocortex, the part responsible for all higher thought, language, logic, and conscious awareness. Within hours, his entire neocortex had shut down. He was in a deep coma. His doctors gave him a 2% chance of survival, and even if he did survive, they expected he would spend the rest of his life in a vegetative state. Alexander spent 7 days in that coma. His neocortex was confirmed to be completely non-functional by CT scans and neurological examinations throughout that period. And yet, during those 7 days, he experienced what he would later describe as the most vivid, most real, most detailed experience of his entire life. He described passing through a realm of extraordinary beauty. He described encountering a being of immense, unconditional love. He described being given information about the nature of the universe that he could not have generated from his own memory or imagination, because the part of his brain responsible for memory and imagination was confirmed to be offline. When Alexander recovered, which itself was considered a medical miracle, he was a changed man. He wrote a book called Proof of Heaven, which spent 97 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. But more importantly, he spent the subsequent years working with physicists, neuroscientists, and consciousness researchers to develop a scientific framework for understanding what had happened to him. His conclusion was identical to the one reached by McDonnell in the Gateway Report. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a filter, a reducing valve that constrains consciousness and confines it to the physical dimension. When that filter is removed, whether through death, deep meditation, or specific training techniques like those developed at the Monroe Institute, consciousness expands into its true, unbounded state. Consider what this means. The United States of America, through its military, its intelligence agencies, and its most prestigious universities, has been assembling the pieces of this puzzle for over half a century. No other nation on Earth has invested this level of institutional effort into understanding the nature of consciousness. From the classified corridors of Fort Meade to the research labs of Harvard, NYU, and Stanford, American investigators have been quietly building a body of evidence that points toward a single, extraordinary conclusion, and the evidence continues to accumulate. In 2025, a multinational group of neuroscientists published what they called the Neptune model, an attempt to explain near-death experiences entirely through brain chemistry, through endorphins, blood gases, and electrical activity. But researchers at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, one of the oldest and most respected consciousness research programs in the world, published a detailed rebuttal. Dr. Bruce Grayson, who has spent over 4 decades studying near-death experiences at UVA, pointed out that the Neptune model failed to account for the most compelling features of these experiences: the verified perceptions of events occurring outside the patient's sensory range, the consistent and detailed accounts from patients whose brains showed no measurable activity, and the profound, lasting transformative effects that distinguish these experiences from any known form of hallucination. The American research community is not in consensus. There is vigorous debate. There are skeptics, and their arguments deserve serious consideration. But the direction of the evidence is unmistakable. Study after study, from the AWARE trials at NYU to the gamma-wave research at Michigan, from the declassified files of the CIA to the clinical observations of doctors at the bedside of dying patients, the data is pointing toward the same extraordinary conclusion. Death is not the end of consciousness. It is a transition. Think about what the United States government knew in 1983. Think about the fact that a military intelligence officer sat down at a desk in Maryland and wrote in precise, technical language that human consciousness can transcend space and time. Think about the fact that this document was classified for 20 years. Think about the missing page 25, which was not recovered for nearly 4 decades. And then think about the fact that in 2023, 40 years later, the most rigorous medical research in the world began confirming exactly what that report described. Don Winner is a retired intelligence specialist and decorated veteran of the United States Air Force, who spent 20 years as a linguist and intelligence analyst. After his military career, he turned his analytical skills to the study of near-death experiences, reviewing thousands of individual accounts with the same methodical rigor he once applied to classified intelligence reports. His conclusion, informed by that military-grade analytical training, is that the patterns in these accounts are too consistent, too detailed, and too verifiable to be explained by any known neurological or psychological mechanism. Something real is happening. Consciousness is going somewhere. The story of American consciousness research is not a story of mysticism or wishful thinking. It is a story of rigorous investigation conducted by military officers, intelligence analysts, neurosurgeons, physicists, and medical researchers at the most powerful institutions in the most powerful nation on Earth. It is a story that began in classified files and is now emerging into the light of mainstream science. The human body is a temporary vessel. The energy that animates it, the consciousness that makes you who you are, operates by laws that we are only beginning to understand. But those laws are real. They are measurable, and the United States, more than any other nation in history, has invested the resources, the talent, and the institutional will to uncover them. When your heart stops, your consciousness does not stop with it. When your brain flatlines, something continues. The gamma waves surge. The awareness persists. The experiences reported by those who have returned are vivid, coherent, and consistent across cultures, religions, ages, and continents. 20% of cardiac arrest survivors remember being conscious during the time when, by every medical measure, they were dead. This is not a matter of belief. This is a matter of evidence. And the evidence, gathered over half a century by the most capable investigators America has ever produced, tells us something that changes everything. You are not your body. You are not your brain. You are something far more enduring than either. And when the final moment comes, when the monitors go silent and the last breath is drawn, you do not end. You continue. That is not a hope. That is not a prayer. That is what the data shows. And it was America that found it first.